Hidden behind the warm smile of Frank Fritz, the man known for rummaging through forgotten barns and collecting dusty gems, was a life that few could have ever imagined. The world saw him as just an antique lover, a man with a quirky eye for rusted relics and vintage oddities. But stepping inside his home after his final days revealed something that rewrote everything we thought we knew. The space wasn't just cluttered with collectibles, it was haunted by secrets, a vault of untold stories. And the moment you step into that villa, you realize you're not just walking into a collector's paradise. You're entering the mind of a man whose quiet life held a storm no one saw coming. The ordinary had been his mask. What lay beneath was astonishing. What stunned everyone wasn't just the sheer volume of what he owned, over 75 meticulously preserved vintage motorcycles, or that among them was a near-mythical 1947 Indian Chief prototype worth a jaw-dropping $250,000. Nor was it the lost Aerosmith tour bus parked in an unassuming garage corner, or the Yoda model from Star Wars, a piece George Lucas himself believed no longer existed. The shock was in the handwritten diaries tucked between dusty manuals and oil-stained maps. Words that told a story far more twisted than any episode of American Pickers ever hinted at. These weren't notes on antiques. They were cries etched in ink, stories of betrayal, deep emotional scars, and battles no camera ever captured. Frank had never chased money. To him, riches were intangible, often found in forgotten pieces of history, rather than in bank accounts. But ironically, he left behind a treasure trove so massive it rivaled museum collections. Yet the most valuable items weren't made of chrome or steel. They were made of memories, of pain, of hard-earned wisdom recorded in diaries no one was meant to find. In them were confessions about the real reason he was let go from American Pickers, along with revelations about those who may have tried to come after his $6 million estate. If that doesn't stop you in your tracks, nothing will. Born in 1963 in Davenport, Iowa, Frank was never the typical kid. While other boys traded baseball cards or biked around the neighborhood, Frank combed junkyards, collecting beer cans, stamps, rocks, things others dismissed. Even paper clips, which he neatly stored in notebooks, were treasures to him. To most, it looked like a strange obsession. But for Frank, it was about preserving stories. Every object whispered something. And early on, he developed an odd fascination with discarded blades, a detail that now seems to foreshadow his gift for finding beauty in the forgotten and danger in the overlooked. His teenage years were shaped by a pivotal friendship with Mike Wolfe, whom he met in 8th grade. Every weekend became a treasure hunt. Basements, flea markets, yard sales, all filled with potential. They were drawn to what others abandoned, relics from lives long gone. Frank could have taken the path his teachers encouraged: college, a stable career. But something deeper pulled him toward forgotten things. Knowledge for him wasn't in textbooks, but in the rusted hinges of antique trunks and the chipped paint of old signage. He eventually became a fire inspector, spending nearly 25 years inspecting buildings across Iowa. It was a job that sharpened his eye, training him to spot flaws, history, and value all at once. Simultaneously, his collection of motorcycles grew. At just 16, he poured all his savings into a 1964 Harley-Davidson. It was a bold move, one that baffled his parents. But to Frank, that bike wasn't just transportation. It was America in motion. He hustled at local jobs, from sprinkler installations to hardware stores, to afford his growing collection. And that garage, it wasn't just a storage space. It was his museum, his refuge. Frank's eye was unmatched. He didn't just buy antiques. He studied them, loved them. While others saw junk, he saw history. He recorded details religiously: where an item came from, who owned it, and what it might mean. He wasn't hoarding. He was preserving. Each item was a memory trapped in metal or wood, and Frank was its keeper. Even during fire inspections, he couldn't help but spot treasures hidden in boiler rooms or hanging behind old doors. For him, forgotten corners always held surprises. It was this obsessive attention to detail, this sensitivity to history's pulse, that gave Frank an edge. One moment he'd be writing up a safety report. The next, he'd be marveling at a vintage fire alarm from the 1940s. Every building was a mystery. Every inspection, a possible adventure. He became a master at seeing through the layers: wood, metal, time. And what he uncovered often stunned even seasoned collectors. He never played by chance. His methods were calculated. Every search, every dig, every pick was backed by decades of silent learning. His first big flip, buying an item for $15 and reselling it for $475, wasn't luck. It was proof that his mind was a vault of knowledge. That moment didn't just earn him money, it validated a lifetime of fascination. From there, the hobby became a livelihood. In 2002, he left his steady job behind and opened Frank's Finds, a small antique shop tucked into Savannah, Illinois. But this wasn't your typical store. Set inside a former opera house with an antique bar, it felt more like a shrine to time itself. Items weren't just placed, they were displayed, curated, honored. Some called it chaotic, but to Frank, it was pure and untouched. A place where every creak of the wooden floor whispered a memory. People came in expecting to browse. They left feeling like they had stepped into a different century. That shop wasn't just business, it was soul. Meanwhile, Mike Wolfe had begun filming his solo hunts, hoping to turn their shared passion into a show. Frank was hesitant. The quiet life suited him. But then came the pin, a tiny trinket he bought from students for $115 and later sold for over $1,400. That flip changed everything. The adrenaline, the recognition. It all came rushing in. And when Mike came calling again, Frank finally said yes. He packed up his world, left the shop behind, and hit the road. 2 old friends, 1 camera, and a truck filled with dreams. Their first episodes were raw but real, and that honesty struck a chord. When American Pickers debuted in 2010, it was an instant hit. Frank, with his grounded nature and quiet charm, became a household name. Over 3 million viewers tuned in, and just like that, the collector from Iowa, who found value in forgotten things, had become the heartbeat of one of the most beloved reality shows in TV history. But as millions watched the man in front of the camera, no one knew the depth of the storm quietly growing behind the scenes. And soon, the world would see that even the calmest faces can carry the heaviest truths. Viewers had always been captivated by their dynamic, a duo that somehow felt inevitable, like 2 threads woven together by fate. They weren't just co-hosts, they were soul companions on a dusty road trip through America's forgotten past. When fans spotted them that October at the California Surf Museum, it was like a pop-up parade had arrived. The scene was unexpected, electric. Frank looked around at the crowd with wide-eyed disbelief, asking, "What's going on here?" But he didn't hesitate. He signed every autograph until there were none left to give. The love was overwhelming, but it was earned. Within just 8 months of its debut, an episode had racked up 5.3 million views. Frank Fritz had gone from small-town picker to national treasure. Still, the magic wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the spontaneity. No script, no plan, just the open road and a passion that couldn't be rehearsed. They traveled in a white Mercedes Sprinter, then later a Ford Transit, humble vessels for a mission much grander than the sum of its parts. One September day in 2011, the journey led them to Champion Auto in southern Maine. The owner, Mario Burnett, was stunned when Mike and Frank walked into his yard. Frank, drawn like a magnet to vintage signs and nostalgic trinkets, felt instantly at home. Mike, as always, was drawn to motorcycles and gear. They stayed for 5 whole days. days filled not with production schedules, but with instinct, history, and a genuine love for the stories hidden in rust and dust. That was the real treasure of American Pickers: rediscovery. Two friends chasing relics of the past, not for resale value, but for the spirit they carried. Frank's interests leaned toward gas station memorabilia and vintage toys, while Mike leaned toward motorbikes and Volkswagens. It was this difference that made their partnership work so well. They weren't mirrors, they were complements. Frank once said that Mike was the more impulsive one, while he preferred to tread carefully. Fans loved that contrast, the balance between Mike's quick-fire decisions and Frank's thoughtful observations. Frank's collection of over 35 vintage motorcycles was proof of his lifelong devotion. That collection wasn't just metal and wheels, it was decades of love. Tucked away in a personal museum, it included rare Indian bikes, British legends like Vincent and BSA, and even a 1942 Harley modified with a Volkswagen frame, custom painted by the iconic Von Dutch. Frank had only dreamed of seeing that bike in real life, until he spotted it at a garage sale. For him, every motorcycle was a time capsule with a heartbeat. In 2013, Frank turned his passion into print, releasing a book that invited readers into the world of vintage bikes. Order, not just a guide, it was a love letter. With humor, practical advice, and heartfelt stories, he made vintage collecting feel accessible, like a shared hobby between old friends. Before the fame, Frank had served as a fire inspector for 25 years, a role that gave him unique access to hidden corners of history, abandoned firehouses, antique equipment, and forgotten helmets. That job turned into another collection, artifacts of firefighting days long gone. Each piece he found brought a memory with it, and that's what Frank cherished the most: the stories. To him, these weren't just items, they were echoes of lives once lived. Whenever Frank picked something up on the show, you could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just looking at value, he was listening for whispers from the past. Toys, tools, household goods, they all told a tale, especially war memorabilia. If an item had belonged to a fallen soldier, Frank often insisted it go to a museum. That quiet dignity, that deep respect, set him apart. Frank wasn't chasing fame. He was preserving memory. That depth made him a favorite among fans who saw beyond the television frame. But behind that inviting grin and gentle demeanor was a man enduring a private war. For over 3 decades, Frank lived with Crohn's disease, a chronic condition that took its toll both physically and emotionally. Friends say he first began suffering in his mid-20s. Even as pain shadowed his every step, Frank kept showing up, never letting on how heavy the burden was. He finally found some peace when he gave up alcohol and committed to sobriety. But the years of strain had already done damage. His health quietly crumbled, until one day, his body had simply had enough. It wasn't until 2017 that the public got a rare glimpse of his internal struggles. That year, Frank was stopped by police after driving the wrong way. He admitted to having had a drink and taking anxiety medication. He later revealed how the pressure of being constantly watched wore him down. Always under scrutiny, always expected to smile. The court let him off with a guilty plea, avoiding jail time, but the public image he had so carefully built began to crack. The man people saw on television wasn't a facade, but it was only half the picture. Off camera, Frank was unraveling in silence. His relationship with co-star Mike Wolfe had also begun to sour. By 2021, Frank admitted they hadn't spoken in 2 years. What hurt the most wasn't the exit from the show. It was the absence. No check-in, no support. He felt sidelined, like a backup player in a band where Mike was always the lead. When Mike posted well wishes about Frank's health, Frank didn't believe it was real. He thought it was just PR. Still, there was a spark of reconciliation in 2023 when the two finally met again, brought together by a mutual friend. But by then, the damage had long been done. During the pandemic, Frank injured his back at home. That injury led to surgery, and the isolation led him toward opioids. What started as a way to manage pain spiraled into dependency. Mike described watching it as seeing a hurricane level everything in its path. The show wanted Frank back, but only if he passed a drug test. He didn't. That was the final curtain call. His last episode aired in March 2020. At first, fans thought he was just taking time off. Even Frank said he hadn't quit. He was just healing. But by July 2021, Mike confirmed Frank wouldn't return. The network moved on. Frank, however, was left behind. He had undergone major surgery, 185 stitches, and 2 metal rods inserted into his spine. Even though he claimed he was ready to come back, the show was no longer his to return to. That decision broke more than his spirit. It shifted the trajectory of his life. By July 14, 2022, tragedy struck again. A friend found Frank unresponsive at home. He'd suffered a severe stroke. Doctors worked quickly, but the damage was irreversible. He lost much of his mobility and cognitive function. After a month in the hospital, he was transferred to a nursing home. What followed was a series of emergency hospital visits and another devastating blow. Frank could no longer manage his finances or his personal care. In August, the court appointed his longtime friend Chris Davis to make personal decisions for him, while a bank was assigned to manage his $6 million estate. It was a heartbreaking fall for someone who had once driven across the country, lighting up the screen with laughter, curiosity, and charm. And as we remember Frank's journey, we must also remember the cost of fame, the silence behind the smiles, and the strength it took to keep going. The heartbreaking truth came out in court documents. Frank Fritz could no longer care for himself. He couldn't cook, couldn't manage housing or medical needs, and without constant assistance, his life was in real danger. Under court supervision, every move made by his guardian and bank was closely monitored. And though he had made millions from American pickers, it was all vanishing fast. His medical care alone cost over $30,000 a month, more than $350,000 a year. But his yearly income from investments barely reached $60,000. The math didn't work. His 24-hour care, specialized equipment, and therapies drained everything. Frank's longtime friend Jerry Jandro revealed plans to auction off Frank's antiques after his passing. But nothing could prepare him for the emotional weight of visiting Frank. Half his body was paralyzed. He'd try to lift his hand, but it would just fall. And the worst part? Frank was fully aware. He knew his body was shutting down. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't fight back. According to Jerry, he just gave up. Even now, fans and collectors are discovering that Frank didn't just save artifacts. He saved memories. In a world that moves too fast, he showed us the beauty in slowing down and honoring what came before. What do you think about Frank's journey and the treasures he left behind? Let us know with a 1 if you believe in his legacy, or a 0 if you see it differently. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.